All right. Hey, welcome back. Lecture 6 this time. This is a lecture where, quite often I will be taking off from things that you're learning. And so I'm very much assuming that you're reading the textbook carefully because my lectures are not generally a regurgitation of what you're reading. I'm expecting you to read and watch the lectures. And while they'll always be overlapped, they'll always be connected, the lectures are not a replacement for reading in a general sense. There are times, and this will be an example, where I will follow the textbook a little bit more closely. And that's mostly if I want to make sure you really got some central story that's going to be relevant to the course as we progress. And that's what we're going to do here. Okay, so lecture 1.6, I'm going to kind of go over the brief history of experimental psychology. I'm going to follow this, by the way, with a discussion of clinical psychology, but I won't be talking clinical in this case here. I'm going to be focusing on experimental psychology. And just to be clear with everybody, what's the difference between those two? The clinical psychology really follows much more of a medical model. It's really about helping people who are struggling with some sort of issue, and treatment becomes a big sort of part of it. Experimental psychologists are all about just trying to understand us. Not the us that's challenged or whatever, but just us, just to understand the average human being and how it all works. And it's really a case of what we sometimes would call reverse engineering. That we exist, we know we can do some really cool things, but we don't know how we do them. And so it's almost like some alien dropped some really cool machine in front of us that can do a bunch of amazing stuff, and now we want to know how. And so we want to sort of take it apart. Now, you can't take human beings apart, right? Well, not generally. But this is the attempt of humans to understand themselves and how they work. Okay. So, if we go through the history, and I'll go through this rather quickly because you're going to get details in the textbook. But again, I'm hoping that because I think the storyline is important, if you're here in the psychology program, especially if you're going to become a major in psychology, you've got to kind of know where we are now and how we got there. And so that's what I'm hoping to give you a rehash of here. I'm assuming you've already read it in your textbook. So where do things start? Well, they don't really start here. I mean, I've already alluded to some of the real starting places before where we had philosophers, kind of suggesting that humans were open to study, that we weren't completely spirits in a material world. We then had biologists kind of confirming that we are at least partly machine-like, that there are aspects of us, and it seems like a lot of us, that is sort of material, physical, and therefore open to scientific study. And then you also had people like the psychophysicists I highlighted earlier. Remember the just noticeable difference kind of thing. And they were showing that you could scientifically study the mind. Okay, and so they are the real precursors. So I think of things like Ernst Weber and Fechner. You may find the textbook, or I talked about Weber, I believe, but Fechner may be mentioned in the textbook as well. These people were trying to understand what our internal mind was like. So remember the weights? You could have those two weights, and when can you notice a difference in those weights? So they were starting to do that kind of research. And the fact that they were finding those mathematical constants and things I highlighted in that math lecture, that started to make the academic community believe that you could study ourselves scientifically. But it was Wilhelm Wundt that really jumped in with both feet. So Wilhelm Wundt said, okay, that is what I am going to do. I am just going to study the mind. And so he was the first to kind of refer to himself as a psychologist, but most importantly, he created the first experimental psychology lab. And he created this lab in Germany, and this lab became the birthplace for psychology. In a real sense, that the people that came and worked with Wilhelm then left his lab and brought psychology to the world, often transforming it as they did so, often changing really what psychology was studying and how it was studying. but it all kind of started with Wundt. And Wundt was what we call a structuralist. Now, this makes perfect sense at his time. When you get the sense of his time, this is a time when people were doing things like what you see on the right in chemistry, the periodic table of elements. They were taking things like water and realizing that, hey, water is actually made up of certain components, hydrogen and oxygen mixed together in a certain way. That's called deconstructionism, kind of bringing things down to their basic elements. And that's what Wilhelm Wundt wanted to do with conscious experience, the experiences we have in our mind. What are the basic elements of conscious experience? That's what he wanted to really understand, and the notion of how these elements could then be combined to produce the rich internal things that we have going on in our head. So let me give you I'm going to give you a taste of something. Let's just bring this up: introspection. So Wilhelm Wundt, how do you see inside people's minds? If you're a scientist and you want to know what's going on in someone else's mind, well, you can't really. But what Wilhelm suggested is you can teach that person to look into their own mind, aka introspection. Okay, now we can all do introspection to some extent. Wilhelm had a real formal notion, but let me give you a taste just so you have a sense of introspection. And this is one of my favorite examples. I'll bring it up every now and then, maybe in the course. But I'll say something like this. Think back to some dwelling, some small, like a family dwelling that you lived in, preferably. Hopefully like, 2 or 3 or 4 bedroom kind of house, something like that, imagine. Or think of a friend's house if that's easier to come to mind. And I'm going to ask you a very simple question about it. But when I ask you the question, I want you to attend to what's going on in your mind. I want you to introspect. Okay, here's the question. How many windows did that dwelling have? Sorry, I may cut you off halfway through, producing a Zeigarnik effect. Remember that? What you've probably noticed is one of two things happened when I asked you that question. Mentally, you were either inside the house, walking through the rooms and kind of looking at windows and counting them, or you were outside the house, walking around the house, kind of looking at the windows and counting them, right? So first of all, when we say things in your mind, that's what we're talking about, right? That wasn't in the real world. There was nowhere in the real world where there was this house. That house only existed in your mind. And you're able to see it, and you're able to kind of do things with that. And so that was the thing that really, fascinated a lot of the early psychologists. That's what they were interested in, was our mind. Psychology started firmly as the study of the conscious mind, of conscious experience. And Wundt would use this process of asking people to describe what happened in their mind when he gave them certain tasks. Okay, 2 caveats I have to give you. First of all, they were big on training people how to do this. Wundt, and especially his student named Titchener, were very formal. So they didn't think, what you just did wouldn't be considered valid introspection to them, because you're a beginner. You don't really know how to do it right. They had a whole manual to teach their participants the proper ways to introspect. And what they were trying to do is take something that's already a little messy, right? By scientific standards, physicists can directly see what they want to study, and they can directly measure it. What he's relying on is what we call subjective report. He can't actually see into the mind. He can't actually measure. He's asking you to kind of do it for him and to let him know what you're seeing. And therefore, he's relying on the accuracy of your introspection. And a lot of people believe that introspection is not accurate, is not valid. That became a real friction for Wilhelm's work. The other thing I want to mention right offhand is the stimuli he used were very simple. I gave you this remember some house from when you were young. He would have like a clicking metronome, and he would have it either click really slowly, chick, 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 or at a faster rate, chick, 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 chick. And he would ask questions like, what changes in your mind when you hear the slow or the fast? And he found people would reliably say certain things. First of all, they'd say the fast one makes them feel happier. The slow one makes them feel a little depressed, etc. So those were the kinds of experiments he was doing, and he was trying to understand the core elements of the conscious mind and how they came together. Okay, now, again, he spawned this whole tradition of scientists who went out into the world and continued doing what Wilhelm was doing. So functionalism and his approaches, his methods, were out there for a while. Not too long after, and it's important, by the way, I'm going to highlight dates here because I'm telling the story in chronological order. So you kind of realize Wundt did his thing in around 1878. Okay, that's when he really sort of formed that lab. And you see he's, sort of living in that era. So now let's go to the next sort of movement in psychology, which we call functionalism. And what you'll see is William James here is about 10 years older. If I go back, 1832 for Wundt, 1842 for William James. So William James is coming down the pipeline about 10 years later. And something really important happened during that time, and that was Darwin. Darwin did his thing, and he did what he did to biology. And basically what he did to biology is he said, stop worrying about what a beak looks like and start asking why it looks that way. To understand the features of a critter, you have to first think about what function different beaks, in this case, serve. So famously, he looked at the finches in the Galapagos, and famously he found things like, hey, the finches that had really long, skinny beaks, they lived in places where there was lots of insects in trees. And so they could beat into the trees and get those insects. The ones that had short, stout beaks, they lived in places where there were nuts available as a food source, and those short, stout beaks could help them crack and eat the nuts. And so the beaks were the way they were for a reason, and you had to really think about the function of that if you wanted to ever reach a true understanding of why it looks the way it does. William James brought that concept into psychology, and it became called functionalism. It's like, okay, Wundt, you guys are all trying to describe what mental states look like, but I'm interested in what they do. What is their function? And I already told you one example here. We're going to talk about each of these when we hit sections of the textbook. We're going to come back to it. So I just want to give you an example of each to try to give you a sense. And this example we talked about already in Hermann von Ebbinghaus's work on forgetting. Remember that dude I told you about that remembered all those words and then let time go by and then saw how many he could remember? And he showed this forgetting function again, and this was in my lecture where I was stressing how, when you can do something like that, fit a nice function to a bunch of data, that really impressed the scientists. And they're saying, wow, so now you're studying forgetting. So forgetting is a process, right? It's not what something looks like in your mind. It's about what's changing. And what's changing is your ability to bring that item to your mind, right? To retrieve it back into your mind. And we can imagine that being able to store items and being able to forget items is useful to us in various ways. And so in that case, Ebbinghaus was studying the function of memory. And that's the kind of thing William James was really promoting in a lot of his work. Now, it's not that functionalism took over structuralism. They kind of coexisted for a while. So some scientists were really focusing on what the mind looked like. Others were focused on this sort of thing, functions. The first group were often criticized because of introspection, being non-scientific. Whereas again, with data like Ebbinghaus's, the functionalist approach seemed like a step forward in terms of scientific rigor. And so over time, functionalism started sort of becoming the much more dominant, especially after, with Darwin's influence in biology, this became the dominant approach to doing things in psychology. It will evolve into what I'll tell you about in a moment called cognitive psychology. But at this point, it was just raw functionalism. Okay, now there's another important aspect of functionalism. Because they were really focused on data like this, and not introspection, it opened up research with animals. And many of you guys probably think of psychology as rat research, etc. Well, where did that start? It started with Thorndike, Edward Thorndike, and it wasn't really even rat research at all. Thorndike, by the way, just to give you a sort of funny story, he was a relatively poor new faculty member. When he was hired, he didn't have very much money. He only had enough for a little apartment, but he wanted to do all this research with animals. William James allowed him to live in his basement and to bring in chickens and cats and all sorts of stuff to do his research. And Thorndike did a lot of the research in William James' basement, which I always thought was kind of fun and interesting. He did clever, kind of weird research. So first of all, there we go. Let's throw the little critter of his research in: cats. He did a lot of research with cats. And what he did is he created these puzzle boxes. Now, if this looks like something that was just thrown together in a DIY kit, it was. Thorndike had people drop off pallets and other stuff that they didn't need anymore, and he created these so-called puzzle boxes. And these puzzle boxes, he could put a cat in, and there would be a way out of the cat, out of the box. If the cat pulled the right levers and pushed the right things and did the right manipulation of stuff, an entrance would open and it could get out. And what Thorndike was interested in, we'll talk about this a lot more, this is really the beginning of behaviorism, as I'll suggest, but he said, hey, if you put the same cat in the same box day after day, originally it takes this cat a long time, 600 seconds to get out of that box. But every time you put him in, it gets a little faster. Oh, okay, he had a bad day here. I don't know why he had such a bad day here. But generally speaking, what we're seeing is a curve that's dropping and getting faster. He's getting faster and faster at getting out. He is learning the maze and learning how to get out. And so Edward really made learning a key issue in psychology. How is this learning happening? And he focused on the influence of success. When the cat does something right, does that make him more likely to do that thing in the future? Something he called the law of effect. We will get to all that detail. The important part I want you to get right now is that he started bringing animals into the research. Now, think of the importance here. We've gone from Wilhelm Wundt, who was doing introspection. Well, you cannot ask a cat to introspect. You can ask it, but it won't give you any useful information, right? And so we've gone all the way to studying animals that couldn't possibly do the introspection thing. And so what are we left with animals? Well, we're left with how they behave, how they respond to things. And so Thorndike's work and the work on animals really kind of did two things for psychology. One, it took it away from a study of the conscious mind, right? Which was what Wundt started it with. And it was more a study of the brain or the organism and how it behaved and what constituted that awareness. And maybe some of its behaviors came from the conscious mind, but maybe some of its behaviors come from instinct or other sorts. And so we have a broadening of what psychology is about. And we also have this emphasis on behavior as something you can scientifically measure better than introspection. And so we have a broadening idea of what psychology is about, but also a more defined idea of how to study it. Study it through behavior. That's sort of what Thorndike was doing, and that became a huge rallying cry. So I've already told you a little bit of this story, but we're starting to put these pieces together now. So we have William James and we have Thorndike doing their things, and it was somewhere around there that the eugenics movement was going on that we talked about, and that Hitler was sort of doing his thing. And so I've already told you that story about, the focus on nature and genetics and all the excitement scientists have. But suddenly scientists like Watson were saying, hey there, hold on. And now you see a little of the context of Watson, right? He'd seen these animal studies. He had been exposed to functionalism a little bit. But especially the work with Thorndike and others convinced him that was the better way to do science. He didn't think it had to be restricted to animal research, though. So he was trying to take some of what he saw as of the advantages of animal research and bring it into psychology. There's another force here we're going to talk about in just a moment, and that force is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud started this new area of psychology, clinical psychology, and we'll talk about it. But a lot of the experimental psychologists didn't like it, didn't think it was very scientific at all, and therefore they wanted to be different, and they wanted to be ultra scientific. They wanted to be the science of psychology. And that was part of what pushed Watson to say, oh, that animal research seems much more scientific. That's how we should do stuff with humans. And so suddenly, he really kind of created this new field called behaviorism. And he set some really specific rules. Don't worry too much about these speech ones, but these other ones are kind of important for now. First of all, he said, stop talking about what's going on in the animal's mind or the human's mind. We don't know. We'll never know. We can never measure that scientifically. What we can measure scientifically is how they behave, what they do, directly observable, things we can see and measure. We should only study things we can see and measure. Hence behaviorism, the focus on behavior. He also said behavior is subject to stimulus-response formulas. So he thought we behave certain ways in response to situations we're in. And that connection between the situation, the stimulus, and that behavior can be reinforced, can be made stronger or weaker. He focused usually on strengthening. That's what Thorndike kind of was focused on with his law of effect. But the idea that starts to emerge here is our behaviors are a reaction to the situation we find ourselves in. But not only the situation we find ourselves in, the reinforcement. So you see this here, predicted and influenced by changing stimuli and reinforcements. So we behave a certain way within a certain environment, and then stuff happens, right? You're in a class, you're confused, you raise your hand, the professor says, yes, you have a question. You ask your question, what happens next? Does that professor take your question in the nicest way and say, thank you for asking that, and then answers it in a way that helps you? That's reinforcing. That's really positive. That's going to make you more likely to ask questions in the future. But what if the professor says, oh, that's a stupid question. I'm not even going to bother answering that. Well, now you've been punished for doing what you did in that context, and you're less likely to do it in the future. So the consequence, so you're starting to get behaviorism, stimulus, response, consequence, and now the link between the stimulus and the response gets strengthened or weakened. Okay, so this became the world of psychological research. This is when we talked about rat research, because Watson and others thought these basic learning processes, and so I should mention that too, the focus is really on learning, right? How the organism changes its behavior over time. And let me say how experience with the world changes that behavior over time. So we're clearly in the nurture, we're clearly in the learning, the effect the environment has on us. And a lot of behaviorists thought this was the same for all animals. And so we don't have to focus on humans here. We can study this in humans, but we can study it in animals, and what we learn in animals will apply to humans. Hence, so much animal research going on at that time. Okay. I said quick history of time. It takes a while to go through some of this, but I want to make sure you get it all. So maybe it's worth a longer lecture on this one if need be. Okay, cognitive psychology. I have been highlighting a person, and if there was a person I'd highlight here, it would probably be somebody named Ulrich Neisser. But I decided instead to highlight this wall of a computer because really, it was this wall of a computer that really ushered in cognitive psychology. A lot of this started out during the war, and it started with a guy named Alan Turing. Famous, check out the movie about Alan Turing. I'm blocking on the name of it right now, but it's a really interesting movie. Alan Turing was an interesting character for a number of reasons. He was a genius. He lived during the war period. He was, by the way, homosexual, and he was persecuted for it, and he was given drugs to try to change him. There's all this horrible stuff around what people tried to do around his sexuality, but he was a genius. And during the war, one of the major challenges was decoding messages that the Nazis were sending. And Turing built what we now consider the first computer, the first electronic device that could decode messages, really highly complex messages. And a lot of people say it's because of Turing's device that the Allies won World War II. A lot of people think it had a huge influence because you're able to pick up communications and respond accordingly. So you had a lot of advanced intelligence in that world. the computer became a model. Like, just think of Turing's thing. It was solving riddles, in a sense. These encoded messages, it was able to decode it. That's something we only used to think a human could do. But he built a machine that could do it. And as these machines developed, they became a sort of analogy for the human mind. They had things like memory. They had input devices. We have input devices. They had output devices like screens. We have output devices like mouths. They had something called RAM, random access memory, which is kind of like our attention or our ability to kind of think of things right now. But they also had memory that you could bring back, bring to mind, or put away, which is kind of like our long-term memory. So at any rate, people became really enamored, and behaviorists said you can't study the mind. But cognitive psychologists started saying, I don't know, I think you can. You can, but you have to be very careful. So the cognitive psychologists learned the experimental rigor from behaviorists. They said we have to be experimentally rigorous, but they didn't agree with the restriction on what you could study. And so they started studying the mind. In fact, there is this relatively famous phrase by Marvin Minsky, the mind is what the brain does. And so they started to see the brain as the hardware, like the hardware of a computer, and the mind as the programs that are running, the software. And they wanted to study that software, try to understand the algorithms the brain is using to interact with the world, often using very complicated experimental designs to do so, but still really kind of, getting to a core understanding of things. Okay, so cognitive psychology was really about brain processes. All right, there's one other piece I want to bring in to the puzzle of all this, and that's biological psychology, not talked about so much in the textbook. But while all of these other branches of psychology were kind of evolving along towards cognitive psychology, there was also people just trying to understand the brain at a very biological level. And that could be, at this sort of level, just trying to understand the structure of the brain and all the different substructures and how they interact. It was also at this level, which is, okay, we know that the basic messages seem to be transmitted by these things called neurons. And so we started to understand the structure of neurons and specifically how they work, how they send messages. So this brought us to an understanding of neurotransmitters, the sort of electrochemical process the brain uses. And so, the bottom line being here, people were starting to understand the machinery of the brain and how the brain works. And that was going on and slowly developing literally since the days of Descartes that we talked about. Continually people were performing autopsies and work of the sort that Broca was doing that I told you about. Remember Broca's area? So there were lesion studies sometimes. So sometimes people would go to war and they would get shot in the head in various spots. And so then you could learn, okay, how does their behavior change once a certain part of their brain is damaged? And sometimes it'd be car accidents, other things. So an area called neuropsychology, the study of people with brain damage, became really big and helped us understand all these things. And it has eventually evolved into what we today call neuroscience, which is the much more specific understanding of the brain, often because of all the new tools we have to watch the brain in action. Okay, so we have all of these things that kind of developed. On the one side, we went from structuralism slowly into functionalism, which kind of gave way to behaviorism for a while, and that made us more scientific, but it restricted what we studied. But then we got to cognitive psychology, and that opened up what we studied again, but we kept that scientific rigor. In the meantime, we were learning a whole lot about how the brain and how it worked, and at some point in time, we got to where we are today. By the way, I was primarily trained as a cognitive psychologist, but today you really kind of need to be three of these things I just told you about at once. You have to know these different areas. Cognitive psychology, so a lot of research now on the experimental side would fall into what we call cognitive behavioral neuroscience. Fancy term. I'm just trying to unpack it here. The cognitive is the cognitive, trying to understand those mental processes, those algorithms the brain uses when it does things like memory, perception, decision-making, etc. And it is sort of like studying the software of a computer. We often study that via behavior, via the things that people do. So we might give them a list of items to remember. Ebbinghaus would be sort of an example of cognitive psychology, by the way, before cognitive psychology existed. But often in our labs, we ask you to make decisions, and we look at your reaction times and your error rates. And various other behaviors. Sometimes it's eye trackers now. So we ask you to read something, but we watch your eyes move as you do things. And so various behaviors are used to infer what's going on in the mind. And so it's sort of like trying to understand computer software based on what it does when you do certain things to it, right? Oh, if I do this, it does that. Oh, there must be some algorithm that looks for that and does whatever. And so cognitive and behavioral have had a marriage for a very long time. Really since the birth of cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology uses behavior to infer processes. But more recently, we have had, it's not been enough to kind of focus on the software. You also have to connect it to the brain. You want to know, okay, what parts of the brain are involved in this and how do they interact? So now we really like to bring things right down to the neuroscience level, understanding the way the brain works, the various subparts of it, what they do, and figuring things in a system kind of approach. How's information being transmitted around, right? So yeah, it's like trying to understand a computer by understanding the hardware, and how the hardware is passing signals from, oh, there's something in the hard drive that's making the hard drive send something to RAM, which is changing the state of RAM, etc. And so we really kind of want to bring these things together now to have a complete understanding of the brain and the mind and how it's doing its thing. Okay, that's very much on the experimental side of things. I alluded the clinical side, but I kind of skipped over it. I'm going to fill in that part of the story as the last lecture of what we do. There's one other thing I want to mention to you. You're going to start seeing some little recordings in the textbook. These are recordings of some of our faculty. Not all of our faculty, I'm afraid. We have to catch up more. But there was an old Sesame Street thing that went like this. These are the people in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood. The whole idea was, on Sesame Street, they wanted to introduce children to the people like firefighters and cooks and police officers that they would see in the neighborhood and make them familiar and friendly to them. Well, when you come back in the fall, you may see some of us in your UTSC neighborhood. And so I kind of want you to know who we are and what we do. Who are the other faculty? What's the areas of research they do? And so we've got these little videos for the faculty to introduce themselves to you and give you a sense. And now that you know a little bit about the different areas of psychology, hopefully you can kind of fit that in and see, oh, that person's a cognitive psychologist mostly. Oh, that person's more on the neuroscience side, etc. Cool. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to leave this one as the second last one for chapter 1. I'll be back to you to talk to you about clinical psychology in just a bit. Okay, bye-bye.